Graham Hancock reveals how ancient Egyptians cut granite with shocking proof. There's a block of pink granite in the Cairo Museum with a drill hole in it that modern machinists still argue about. Not because it is broken, because it is too good. The hole is round, the walls are smooth, and running down the inside of it is a tiny spiral groove, the same kind of mark a drill bit leaves today when it bites into stone and turns. Someone made that hole more than 4,000 years ago, with no electricity, no steel, and, according to what most textbooks still say, nothing but soft copper tools and a handful of sand. That is the claim this video is going to test. Not with speculation, with the actual experiments that have been run, the actual tools that have been rebuilt, and the actual argument that has divided archaeologists, engineers, and one very famous writer named Graham Hancock for the better part of 50 years. Let's start with why granite is even a problem, because most people assume the mystery of Egypt is the size of the pyramids. It isn't. Most of the Great Pyramid is limestone, and limestone is soft. You can scratch it with a copper chisel, split it with wooden wedges, and haul it into place with rope, ramps, and enough manpower. None of that breaks any law of physics. It is simply an enormous logistics problem, and logistics problems can be solved with time and organization. Granite is a completely different animal. It is an igneous rock born from cooled magma, packed with three stubborn minerals: quartz, feldspar, and mica. Quartz alone sits at a 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, the scale scientists use to measure how easily one material scratches another. Copper, the primary metal available to the Egyptians during the Old Kingdom, sits at around 2.5 to 3. That is not a fair fight. That is closer to trying to carve steel with a butter knife. And yet the granite got cut. Inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, there are granite beams weighing in the range of 25 to 80 tons each, hauled into position and fitted so precisely that the chamber has survived earthquakes for over 4,000 years. At the Valley Temple beside the Sphinx, granite blocks are joined so tightly that you cannot slide a piece of paper into the seam. And scattered across Egyptian museums are granite cores, the cylindrical plugs of stone left behind when something drilled into a larger block, with those same spiral grooves running down their sides, the fingerprint of a rotating cutting tool. An American engineer named Christopher Dunn spent years examining these cores and argued that the spiral pitch implied a drill descending into the stone far faster than hand-powered tools should allow. His conclusions are controversial and not accepted by mainstream Egyptology, but the cores themselves are real, and they sit in museum drawers waiting for anyone who wants to go look at them. So what does the standard explanation actually say? For roughly a century, the accepted answer has been copper and sand. The idea is that copper saws and copper tube drills were dragged or rotated against the granite, not to cut it directly, but to serve as a soft carrier for loose quartz sand, which was the material actually doing the abrading. Add dolerite hammerstones for rough shaping, add enormous amounts of time, and add thousands of workers, and you get the pyramids. It is a tidy story, and it has been repeated in classrooms and documentaries for generations. The trouble is that almost nobody tested it properly until fairly recently. The person who did was an Egyptologist named Dennis Stocks, working out of the University of Manchester, who spent years actually building the tools and running the experiment rather than just describing it. He cut real granite with copper blades and wet quartz sand, exactly as the textbooks describe, and he measured everything: the cutting rate, the tool wear, the surface finish. What he found did not exactly kill the copper and sand theory, but it made it a lot less comfortable. Progress was measured in fractions of a millimeter per hour. The copper wore down fast, consumed by the very sand it was supposedly just carrying. And the cut surfaces were rough, not the smooth, almost polished granite you can still run your hand over in Egypt today. Stock's own conclusion was that the method worked, technically, but it required an almost unbelievable amount of labor and time to produce results anywhere close to what survives. And even then, the finished quality was hard to match. This is the gap that Graham Hancock has spent roughly 4 decades pointing at. To be clear about who he is, Hancock is not an archaeologist or a material scientist. He's a journalist and author, and large parts of his broader work, including his ideas about a lost global civilization, are firmly rejected by mainstream archaeology, and viewers should know that going in. But his specific objection about granite cutting has always been narrower and more mechanical than his other claims. His argument, repeated across books, documentaries, and interviews, is simply this: the tool marks on ancient Egyptian granite do not obviously match what soft copper and loose sand should produce, and the field has spent more energy dismissing him personally than actually rerunning the experiment to check. For most of that time, the response from Egyptology was less about the stone and more about Hancock's credentials. And that response wasn't entirely unreasonable. His broader theories really do go far beyond what the evidence supports, and mainstream researchers are right to be skeptical of a writer with no training in archaeology or metallurgy making sweeping claims about lost technology. But it also meant a fairly narrow, testable question: did copper and sand actually produce these specific artifacts? Got tangled up with much bigger, much shakier claims, and rarely got tested on its own terms. Where things get more interesting is in the space between the two extremes. Independent of the Hancock debate entirely, other researchers have tried variations on the ancient toolkit. Some experiments have used harder abrasives than plain desert sand, crushed quartz, and in a few cases, corundum-based abrasives, the same family of mineral that includes ruby and sapphire and sits near the top of the hardness scale, just below diamond. Corundum does not occur naturally in the granite regions of Egypt, so if it was ever used, it would have had to be imported, which is plausible given how extensively the Egyptians traded across the Sinai, the eastern desert, and further afield for other rare materials like lapis lazuli and incense. Some hobbyist and small-scale trials using harder abrasive mixes have cut noticeably faster than the plain sand method and produced smoother finishes. It's an intriguing lead, but it's important to be honest about where this stands. There is no confirmed, peer-reviewed archaeological find of corundum residue inside ancient Egyptian cut marks. Claims to that effect have circulated online, including in some documentary-style videos, without a verifiable published source behind them. And until that changes, it belongs in the category of an interesting hypothesis, not a proven discovery. What we can say with confidence is narrower and honestly still remarkable. The copper and sand method, as originally tested, really does struggle to explain the speed and precision of the finest Egyptian granite work. That's not a fringe opinion. It's something plenty of mainstream researchers acknowledge, even while disagreeing with Hancock's larger conclusions. The most common academic answer isn't a missing miracle tool. It's a combination of things: much longer time frames than we intuitively imagine, harder abrasive sands than the purest desert sand, tube drills using the weight of the tool itself rather than muscle pressure, and, critically, generations of specialists who did nothing else but work stone their entire lives, passing hard-won technique from master to apprentice. A skilled worker who has ground granite for 30 years, using tools tuned by decades of trial and error, is not the same as a modern engineer picking up a copper blade for the first time and calling the job impossible after an afternoon. That's also, in a strange way, the most human part of this story. Whether the final answer turns out to be better abrasives, better technique, sheer accumulated skill, or some combination researchers haven't fully nailed down yet, the ancient Egyptians clearly weren't stumbling into these results by accident. Cutting granite into 70-ton beams and fitting them so tightly you can't slide paper into the seam takes planning, measurement, quality control, and an institutional memory that outlived any single worker's lifetime. Whatever tools were actually in their hands, the organization behind that work was genuinely sophisticated. So where does that leave Hancock's 40-year argument? Not proven, and not dismissed either. The core observation, that the finish and precision of the finest granite work is hard to fully reproduce with the simplest version of the copper and sand method, holds up under testing, and Stock's own experiments are part of the reason we know that. What doesn't hold up, or at least isn't established yet, is any specific, verified physical evidence for a more exotic solution like imported corundum abrasive. The honest answer, the one that respects both the engineering problem and the limits of the evidence, is that this remains a genuinely open question in experimental archaeology, one where careful replication work is still being done, and where the final answer might turn out to be a fairly unglamorous mix of skill, time, and better materials than modern reconstructions have always used. Maybe that's less satisfying than a single dramatic reveal, but it's also a better reflection of how real historical mysteries usually get solved. Not with one microscope image that changes everything overnight, but with decades of people rebuilding the tools, testing the claims, arguing about the results, and slowly narrowing down what's actually possible. The granite doesn't care who's asking the question. It just sits there, cut and polished and 4,000 years old, waiting for someone to explain it properly. So here's what I want to know from you. If a civilization that old could organize labor, trade routes, and craftsmanship well enough to produce work like this, what does that change about how you think about ancient and primitive in the same sentence? Let me know in the comments.